Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. Today I'm going to take you through a walk through the front lines, but it's worth noting that really this is just a big example. And I talked about fifth generation warfare yesterday in my extra video. Go and check that out. But what is fifth generation warfare? Well, instead of conventional warfare, it's a move to the battle space being one of information and narratives and winning the hearts and minds of people. Today is just a really good example of the fact that there are competing narratives going on, and it's a question of who you believe. So in the front lines, it really is, there's this digital appraisal, digital representation situation, which is on the one hand, you've got pro-Ukraine voices, and on the other hand, you've got pro-Russian voices. And they will claim contradictory things. We occupy this area. And often they're just villages, tiny towns and villages. And it's like, okay, I mean, the truth will out eventually. So there's no point lying, but someone is incorrect here. Or, someone's interpreted sources incorrectly. What is going on here? Something's going on here, because you both cannot be correct. Anyway, it's just worth bearing that in mind. So when I'm making my claims about the front lines here, just have a big bucket of salt nearby, because what I say may well be incorrect based on the sources that I used being incorrect. And the truth is often somewhere in the middle, and will certainly come out in a wash. So rushing to conclusions may be a bit dangerous. But anyway, just there you go. That's my preamble. Let's just talk a little bit about Belarus. I mentioned that there were 60,000 troops sort of ready to go in Belarus, and someone called me out on that because actually they're not all frontline troops, and of course that's correct. So some of these will be engineers, mechanics, cooks, logistics people, truck drivers, people that sit in tents looking at maps, all this kind of stuff. So actually not all those people would be able to be mobilized, and if there was a front created up the north here where Belarus attacked, then it's not going to be 60,000 Belarusian troops. It's going to be maybe 10,000 plus, somewhere around that area, 10 to 20,000 maybe, I don't know. But that's worth bearing in mind. Russia, Belgorod has been hit, so Kharkiv is here. Belgorod is this region, and there's a city just north of the Ukrainian border. Now, the Russians hit the energy infrastructure after the Kerch Bridge was attacked, and did for a couple of nights. That has been an ongoing concern for the Ukrainians. They've hit the energy infrastructure back in Russia, but they've only got sort of medium-range missiles here, that they don't have the cruise missile capability that can hit far into Russia. So when they are taking out the energy infrastructure of Russia, they're just taking out Belgorod region. And there have been blackouts. Ukraine did hit these, it did hit electricity substations in Belgorod that had caused the Russians a few headaches, with some electricity blackouts experienced. Okay, so let's take a look at the Kupiansk-Svatove-Kreminna front line. So just to remind you all, this is this northeastern section of Ukraine. And it's originally, the Kharkiv counteroffensive got to the Oskil River, and that would have been all this bright yellow. It's now not bright yellow because that's old news now, and we are concerning ourselves with this Kupiansk-Svatove-Kreminna front line. So there's been some liberated territory here, but even there, some of it's gone back to Oka because it's kind of old news as far as war map is concerned. Now, there have been some movements up north here, particularly around the Svatove-to-Kupiansk area, and that's what we're going to sort of focus on to begin with. So here is that area, Kupiansk down to Svatove, and I'll zoom in a little bit. So this is what I said yesterday. This is Kupiansk up here, and this is Svatove down here, that there are these settlements, Vilshana, Peshotrevnevi, and Kislivka, that are in the grey zone, contested, and the front line comes down something like this. That's changed a little bit, I would say. Maybe the Ukrainians have slightly more control over some of these areas than before. But again, when I have this nice smooth line, it is actually quite spiky, as the Ukrainians will be having a little unit attacking here or doing some reconnaissance or whatever, and then the Russians might be attacking a little bit here. So this is actually a representative of a very spiky front line, rather than that nice smooth front line. And so this is what I think now is possibly the case. So I've zoomed in a little bit and given it a bit of terrain topography. We've got Svatove down here, sort of just off the map there, and Kupiansk here and a bit north of Kupiansk. So Vilshana and Peshotrevneve are being, I think, contested quite directly by the Ukrainians. And then there are these claims that the Ukrainians possibly have liberated Kislivka. They're certainly fighting over it at the moment. So I've drawn a line through there, and claims that Tabaivka has been liberated. And there's a small village here where there has been visual evidence of Russian soldiers surrendering, possibly conscripts, but certainly soldiers surrendering there. So I've put that little settlement under Ukrainian control, but it could well be a grey zone. So they really are, fighting to get across this P07 highway that turns into sort of the P66 further down south. And the line could go something like this, but as I say, very zigzaggy and could well be all of this grey area. But Kislivka certainly looks like it's under a lot of pressure, and there's claims that even Ivka has been liberated. So, and Orliansky pushing towards Orliansky. So all of this leads me to believe that that's probably something like the front line, give or take. And then as we come down past Svatove to the east, we start to hit the Kherson River, where the front line has taken itself down that river. So if I go back to the War Mapper map, here we have the river just sort of starting up around here, and you have these three towns that have for quite some time been under Russian control, and then that switches about halfway down the Kherson River to Makivka, where we've got Makivka and Nevsky down here that are in the Ukrainian control. Well, it looks like this top town, there's some evidence that has been liberated. So Kovalivka here, there is some visual evidence that the Ukrainians are in there. But again, that could be just hotly contested. But it does, I think, represent a slight movement closer and closer to Svatove. That Svatove has to be slightly worried. The people there, they have been getting people out of there, civilians out of there, or at least pro-Russian civilians, over the last week or so. So they are preparing for this eventual onslaught. Now, there have been claims about amassing Ukrainian troops in this area, so we should expect this to be this front line to be slowly moving eastwards. But Raihorodka seems to be holding out for the Russians, and below that, a couple of settlements there, Novodvodyane here. We shall see what happens. I guess what they're trying to do really is to provide a bit of a buffer zone so that this front line can either build defenses or to give themselves a breather, to allow for supply lines up and down. But it looks further down south. Well, this is where we get to competing narratives. So yesterday, this is what I said the front line looked like. So the Kovalivka, that's actually not accurate, because I reckon that is now under Ukrainian hands. But then down here, it starts getting a little bit foggy. We're not quite sure. Grey zone, maybe. And who controls what? Well, the Russians claimed, as I said to you in the preceding days, that they claimed to occupy Terny and Torske, which is down here. Zarichny, maybe less so, but certainly around here. And Dobrova, and then the Ukrainians came back and said, no, that's a load of rubbish. Here, Yampolivka, that's the other one, and this is kind of where I drew it. But actually, the Ukrainians said, no, that's not true. And in fact, I then said, okay, the Ukrainians control this area. The Russians a little bit further back, and there's this grey zone. But then again, the Russians are coming out and saying these are being contested. So again, they're making claims about these settlements. Who do you believe? They both can't be right. Someone is wrong. Someone is wrong Either the pro-Ukrainians or the pro-Russians. But again, I would always, well, in this case, it's a little bit different because the burden of proof here is on both, because they're both claiming they are counterattacking, liberating, and now it's so confusing that we don't know who occupies what. But all I can say is that we've got very much better reason to believe the Ukrainians than the Russians. It doesn't really help the Ukrainians to lie. I think they realize that more, where the Russians are so much more used to lying, and we've got this whole problem with going up the hierarchy of control and command and claims being inflated to please the people above them, because that's the kind of way that army operates and the command structures operate. It's always about, shoot the messenger, so the messenger has to be reporting something really positive. And I think that whole system means that the Russians end up being less trustworthy than the Ukrainians when they are making claims. So I just, over time, the last 7 months has taught me that I'm much more justified in believing what the Ukrainians claim than the Russians. But that's not to say the Ukrainians are always correct and the Russians are always wrong, of course. Anyway, so that's all open to debate. Things have moved up north a little bit more, down south here towards Kreminna. I guess less so, but there are competing narratives. Okay, let's move towards Bakhmut. Bakhmut is this town of contention towards Donetsk that the Russians claim they have made lots of claims about over the last bunch of months. They are trying to encircle the town, but they have only been moving a matter of meters over weeks. And let's just focus on that for a little bit. So let's have a little look then. The area of much debate, well, this is what I said the other day, which was that Bakhmut was being contested in the eastern suburbs, but the Russians had claimed originally to have taken Vesela Dolina, Zaitsevo, and Odradivka, and then you've got this Ivanhrad and Opitny here. That the next day they claimed the Russians claimed they had occupied and were in control of. And then the Ukrainians have since come back and said, well, actually, no, you don't have Opitny. And in fact, Ivanhrad is contested as well. And so the answer, the question is, who do you believe? Indeed, I'm kind of now drawing this line up through Odradivka. I think that's contested, possibly, grey zone. The other side of Ivanhrad, and this is all contested. And up even the eastern suburbs, the Ukrainians are saying, actually, you aren't really in here fighting like you've been claiming. And then up through Bakhmut-Ski and Solidar. So this is where I'm going to talk to you a little bit about philosophy. Just a little side note here that might be quite useful for you when interpreting or evaluating what people are saying. So if you have a status quo and someone comes along and tips it up the apple cart to make a claim that is against the status quo of what we all believe, then the person who's making that claim has the burden of proof, usually. So if someone comes along, like I believe the world is like it is, and then someone comes along, let's say Pete comes along and says, hey JP, unicorns exist, then it's not up to me as a person who believes in the status quo to have to prove that unicorns don't exist, right? That's the burden of proof is on Pete for coming up and saying, hey, I've got this new claim, unicorns exist. Okay, fair enough. What's your evidence for that claim? So now let's use that here, right? So if we have the status quo, which is Ukrainians occupy and control this territory, and the Russians are coming along, and these Russian sources are saying, the Russians have taken over Opitny and Ivanhrad. Okay, fair enough. That's a new claim that's changing the status quo. The burden of proof is on you to provide evidence to support that. So if you're not providing geolocated visual evidence for that, then actually I'm justified in believing the status quo, which is to say that my lines are going to be cautiously on the side of the Ukrainians, not because I'm pro-Ukrainian in any significant way, although I might be in terms of morality and politics and whatever. But in this case, I'm not drawing the lines to support the Ukrainian position. I'm drawing those lines because you haven't provided me sufficient evidence to change my opinion of where those lines should be. So the burden of proof is on the Russian sources that are claiming that there have been advances for the Russians, that there's a change in territory. You need to provide the evidence for that. Otherwise, I'm going to just cautiously sit back and say, no, the Ukrainians still control that. And if the Ukrainians are saying they still control it, and you haven't provided significant evidence to suggest that they don't, then I will believe the Ukrainians. As well, considering the fact that I've got good justification for believing the Ukrainians over the Russians based on previous evidence and the Russians not being so trustworthy. But I don't want to go down that road at the moment. Just a little talk about burden of proof. If you look at, say, Ryman, who's a pro-Russian voice, here you have admitting that now Opitny is contested and it kind of goes through Ivangorod and Odrodivka is under Russian control, but then the Ukrainians are, claiming that's not actually the case. And then moving up north goes through Bakhmutsky, just to the sort of east of Soledar, and then on and on. So this is a case of competing claims over what place is controlled by which side. Who knows? I mean, it's not like Ivangorod is a particularly large place. This tiny little place on the right, to the right of Opitny here. Neither of them are large. I show you some visual footage of somewhere at least near there, and it's all just completely blown apart. They're contesting rubble essentially, and which is desperately sad. But yeah, it's a game of competing narratives. Who you believe? This is a pro-Ukrainian source, which is north of Bakhmut. So it comes through Bakhmutsky down here, doesn't show them actually controlling, or doesn't show the Russians controlling any significant amount of Bakhmut. That there's a bit of a grey zone really on the edge of Bakhmut, whereas the Russians say actually they are fighting on the streets there. And then down here to Odrodivka and past Ivangorod and Opitny, this source is claiming that actually Ukrainians still control all of those places. The idea with the Russians that they were going to do a pincer movement to completely encircle Bakhmut and take out these sort of roads leading to Bakhmut, but that just seems still a pipe dream in terms of how long. I mean, they're fighting over meters a day. How long is it going to take them to gain that amount of ground, which seems, fairly insignificant, really. There's not a lot in between there. This is like open ground here, but they are taking so long to take control of these places. If you move down to Donetsk and they're moving out into Pisky and Pervozmaisky, again, meters a day. Just is desperately painful and slow for them. So there you go. That's what's happening there. Not a lot happening on the Zaporizhzhia front line. A few areas of fighting. Nothing unusual. Melitopol has been hit overnight by the Ukrainians, and this is worth sort of thinking about because, yesterday even this is Tim White saying, I wrote about explosions in Melitopol which the occupiers passed off as shooting down Ukraine drones. Now the exiled mayor of the city says they hit a Russian military base with 4 powerful explosions felt throughout Melitopol. If they are hitting key installments here and places, targets, what's their game? Is it this long-awaited attack that's going to come down through and encircle Melitopol or down through Mariupol? There are amassed forces supposedly here and supposedly in Zaporizhzhia, north of Melitopol. Are they shaping a future conflict by hitting places in Melitopol, or is this just what they do? They're just taking out supplies and bases where they can. Okay, let's move on to Kherson and the lack of movement that's taken place there, but also a little bit of what the different narratives are claiming is true. So Kherson, fine. Let's find me the right map. Here we have not a lot of movement. There are sort of usual swapping of artillery fire and small incursions, recce's and whatnot. Really, the main area of interest is in this northern Kherson area, where, as you can see, this pink area suggests that this is the grey zone, or the pink zone here, contested area. And I previously had said, given a nice, neat front line for Milove right around to Kostromka and eventually to Snirivka, that there was a little attack maybe, but that nothing much has come of that. But there you go. There are constant. So the Russians have supposedly done some counterattacks here and up here, and even so now they're talking about a counterattack in Novokamyanka, which is an area that I said was fairly safely behind Ukrainian lines. Well, actually now I put this area in grey here because there are claims. This is from Defmon, who's pretty consistently accurate with his maps. Does a lot of geolocation, uses FIRMS data, which is the NASA sort of far heat data that you get to find out where there are fights going on and where there's artillery fire and whatnot. So he's got the front line pretty much as I have Milove across around here, although his is a bit further north towards the Brid, which is interesting. But he's got this area in yellow, and that's to say, actually, from Duchany down to Milove, it's not so obviously in control of the Ukrainians. And in fact, there's a couple of settlements here. So Kachanka and Sublikivka on the Dnipro River that are being contested. Okay, so this is your grey zone here. So maybe the Ukrainians are under some pressure with some sort of counterattacks from the Russians, which again, that's nothing unusual. You'd expect that, but with the amount of delay that there's been, this operational pause, and supposedly these troops are massing in Kherson, but with nothing to be heard or said about them beyond that, one wonders, what the game is here. As ever, they are hitting the pontoon bridges and the bridges and pontoon ferries and all these different ways of getting across the river continually, but not much other movement on that front. Just a case of admitting, I guess, that these nice, easy front lines, as I keep saying, aren't actually representative of the truth necessarily, because there will be a lot of give either way, and both sides attacking each side of that line. And in this case, some of that area north of that line is probably hotly contested. Anyway, there you go. Not a lot of movement, but just a case of getting you to watch out for who you are listening to, and whether that is entirely correct. Question your sources, including myself, obviously. So you can subscribe, share my videos. That'd be great. Or you can even help out the channel with buy me a coffee, PayPal, and the YouTube thanks feature below if you're able to, of course. And you can even buy some merchandise through UA Supporter, which is reporting from Ukraine's sort of a collaboration with them, and their merchandise that they sell, I get a tiny little bit of a cut. So if you want to check out some of their stuff, they've got some lovely caps, all sorts of stuff. Check out their merchandise, loads of stuff to have a look at there, or some mugs or a phone cover. Anyway, thanks for all your support. Really appreciate the kind words and the generous support that you give to the channel, and also really impressed with the extra video yesterday and the comment thread underneath, which is really, really rich content. Like, YouTube comments are notoriously rubbish. It's just full of invective and people slagging each other off. And actually, what I'm trying to do is develop, that's why I'm interacting so much, a really useful community of ideas and thoughts. So I was really impressed with the one on yesterday's extras video. Fantastic. Anyway, thanks so much again. See you in the extra video today a bit later.